Well, hello. I hope you're having a great week, even in the midst of this period of isolation or what we'd call social distancing, a new term for all of us. Anyway, last week I talked about St. Patrick. I talked about the fact that he spent 6 years in isolation, but it became one of the most spiritually fruitful times of his life. And that's really my motivation for putting together this kind of this mini series to help this time of isolation become spiritually fruitful for you, so that when you leave this period of isolation, which we all will at some point, that you will be able to face the many challenges that's in the weeks, the months, the years ahead. Anyway, again, the means of doing this is simply by talking about the spiritual disciplines. Again, the spiritual disciplines are just something, they're called spiritual habits, spiritual practices of the Christian life. They include things like prayer and like Bible study, and some also the non-traditional things like fasting and meditation and even the silence. Anyway, so what I want to do is use my time, use my education, use my years as a pastor simply to begin to teach you about the spiritual disciplines, and hopefully you'll begin to apply them, during this particular time of isolation. But before I dive into the specific disciplines, which I will do next week, I want to first just spend the remaining minutes just talking about what spiritual disciplines aren't and what they are. Spiritual disciplines are not ways that we try to manipulate God into loving us more. Somewhere along the line, Christians have this idea that if I do my prayers, if I read my Bible, that somehow I'm going to please God, I'm going to stay on His good side. So much so that if we don't read our Bible, if we don't engage in our quiet time or whatever, we feel guilty that God is somehow mad at us. And don't get me wrong, God is pleased when we do anything to try to get closer to Him. But the reality is, we cannot do anything to earn His love for us. Because again, that love has already been earned by way of the cross. Most of us are familiar with that passage out of John 3:16. It says, "For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him would not perish but have eternal life." Again, what that passage reminds us of, especially during the season of Lent, is that what we could not do ourselves, God did through Jesus Christ. God did through the cross. He gave us that forgiveness of sins. He gave us that love. My point being, again, that the spiritual disciplines, again, are not a way to earn God's love or possibly earn our way even into heaven. No, again, that's already been accomplished by what Christ did on the cross, and through those and to those who have accepted, again, that free gift of eternal life. Anyway, so if the spiritual disciplines are not about earning God's love, what's the purpose of them? Why do we do that? Why do we engage in the spiritual disciplines? In a nutshell, the reason we do it is to give God space to do within us what we can't do ourselves, which is basically to look more like His Son, Jesus. Contrary to what some people think, this time on earth, even the time in church, is not a time that's like a waiting room, like some sort of a spiritual waiting room where we wait until that night train comes along and carries us off into heaven. No, we've got stuff to do. We have to be disciples of Jesus Christ. Back in the day, disciples were followers of their teachers, of their rabbis. And not only would they follow their teachings, they would try to be like them, to live a life that's characterized, that has the same characteristics as their teachers. In the case of Jesus, it would be like, our life would be characterized by things like loving our enemies, even those people that are a different political affiliation. Having self-control over our earthly appetites. Possibly being more generous with their finances, or caring more for the outcasts, for the refugees, for the poor, for the widows, or even having more faithfulness in the midst of a crisis such as the pandemic that we're in the middle of right now. The bottom line, what becoming like Jesus means, living a life that Jesus would live if He were living inside of us. And that the reality is that when we do that, it's not just beneficial for the future, which it is when we go off into heaven, but it actually has benefit for life right now, for our life right now. It makes us live the abundant life that Jesus said that we can have right now. Again, not simply when we get off and go off into heaven. And some of you are saying, well, yeah, that sounds good, Chuck, but it sounds pretty difficult to me. In fact, it sounds almost impossible to be like Jesus. Well, it is difficult, but it's not impossible. What makes it difficult, though, is basically when we try to do it on our own. Again, when we try to do something that only Christ can do or God can do within us, transform our inner life. It's what people refer to as spiritual transformation. Spiritual transformation is not something we can just try to do on our own, like we could muster up enough willpower, we could be more like Jesus. But the good news is what we cannot do in ourselves, again, God can do in us. But it doesn't let us off the hook. We still have a role to play. We still have to do something. As Paul refers to, we still have to train to be like Jesus. In fact, there's a great passage in 1 Timothy that Paul writes. I think I'm going to put my glasses on here so I can see it, though. Paul writes, physical training is of some value, but training in godliness has value for all things, holding promise for both the present life and the life to come. Let me repeat that. Physical training is of some value, but godliness has value for all things, holding promise for both the present life and the life to come. What I love about this, Paul's using a sports metaphor to talk about, to emphasize the importance of the spiritual life. In other words, what he's saying is just as it's important to train for some sort of a sporting event, it's also important to train to be like Jesus, to be godly like Jesus. You don't just try your way into being like Jesus any more than you would try your way to be a professional sports figure. A good example would be baseball. It'd be great if I could go down to Florida right now, which I'd love to do, and kind of join in spring training, which I don't think is going on right now. But let's say I decided I was going to go to Florida, and the Pirates were actually training, and I decided I'm going to step on the field, and I'm going to step up to the plate, and I'm going to attempt to hit a 90-mile-per-hour fastball. I suspect that I probably would miss a few. I probably would miss all the balls coming my way. On the other hand, if I was to have spent maybe the last year, over in the batting cages over in North Park or whatever, and just hitting ball after ball, thousands of baseballs going 90 miles per hour at me, I'd probably be able to step onto that field and be able to hit a number of baseballs coming at me. The point being is, again, that anything worthwhile requires training. Not just trying, but training. Again, what is true in any worthwhile endeavor, such as sports or music or anything else, is definitely applies to the spiritual life. The difference is we're not stepping into the spiritual life to hit a 90-mile-per-hour fastball, but we are stepping into the spiritual life so that we might be able to look more like Jesus. And the reality is that nobody that's watching this video, including myself, looks like Jesus all the time. Especially when we're in the midst of some sort of a crisis, which we all are right now. In case you haven't noticed, I think people are getting a little bit anxious, a little bit impatient with each other. And that impatience is expressed in many different ways. Maybe you're getting a little bit impatient with your children because they've been at home for a week or so now. And you're just getting really short-tempered, really impatient, maybe impatient with your spouse. Maybe you're getting impatient, with the drivers through the drive-through restaurants, such as Starbucks, because they're not moving along at the pace you think they need to move or whatever, or they're getting in your way, they're cutting into line or whatever. Or maybe you're getting impatient with the people at the grocery store because they took the last roll of toilet paper or something. And so you realize that and you're thinking, okay, I'm going to try to be more patient the next time I go to the grocery store. But you find, that you fail. Again, you're trying to hit that 90-mile-per-hour fastball, but you keep failing. And again, the reason is you have not given space for God to do his part of the thing, God to do his work. And the way he does his work, or where he does his work, is in the context of the spiritual disciplines. So we find that as we begin to practice the spiritual disciplines, we create space for God to do his work. And over time, we may find that we're not patient all the time, but we're getting better. And a year from now, we definitely look more patient than we did last year. Anyway, that's really all I want to cover today. But my point again is that, again, we engage in the spiritual disciplines not to earn God's love, But we do it simply so that we may be able to put ourselves in a posture to begin to look more like Jesus. And so anyway, the next week I'm going to begin to talk about some of the specific spiritual disciplines. But I thought what I'd do is kind of just give you an assignment. If you're still watching this video, just what I'd like you to do is just kind of be aware of your week. As you go through your days this coming week, or even through the weekend, just observe how you're doing with patience, how you're interacting with people, how you're interacting with your spouse, your children. And maybe not simply about patience, maybe just pay attention to how you're dealing with self-control or a lack of self-control when it comes to TV or eating or drinking or whatever. Or pay attention to what's going on in your mind. Are you dealing with some sort of excess fear or anxiety? Just pay attention. And I could pretty much guarantee 100% that you will become more aware of areas where you don't really look like Jesus. And areas, again, that could use really kind of a spiritual workout. Areas that need a little bit of training in godliness. Anyway, that's all I have for today. So what I would say is just continue to trust God this week. Continue to wash your hands and do the best you can to stay inside. Till next week, take care.